Today, I'm going to talk about my strange social scene that has picked up in my new life, I suppose, in the last, yeah, it's a little over a year and a half now. Although really it only began in October or so of 2024 that I really started hanging out with new folks. And it is a little hard to figure out where my place is, to be honest, because I find myself to be considerably older than the demographic of the people I'm hanging around with in a number of the groups that I'm with. Now, uh, one would maybe say, okay, well, that's because you're the leader or the old man that provides wisdom, or maybe you're the creepy old dude that isn't taking a hint to get the hell out of there. I don't think that's true because in all these different groups, I get invited outside of the normal group itself to attend, and I talk back and forth with all these people, and they treat me like a peer, and it's only strange times where the fact that I'm considerably older, where I don't understand their pop culture references and stuff like that, where it comes up. So last night, I was at an anime group that I'm a member of. Now, of course, the subject material being what it is, you're going to have a younger demographic anyway. And it's funny because the kind of stuff I like doesn't really jive with most of the people there. They might have seen some of the things that I like, but anime, like any other medium, it's like saying I like movies, or whatever. And it's like you can have horror, genre, you can have, action paced genre, and the kind of stuff I like is kind of the corny slop. Like I joke that I'm like I am scraping the bottom of the barrel so much that I'm getting the wood off of it, the kind of stuff that I like, because it's bad, it's cheesy, but I love it, I can't help it. Um but last night, there's a new guy that's getting shown up into this group for a couple of times now, and he's quite a character. I like him a lot. He's fun. He's very extroverted, and one of the things I noted right away about him is that he goes around the table and makes sure to talk to everyone for some length of time, and he's really making people feel very special because he's a cool dude. He's like riding a motorcycle, he's very svelte, he's very personable and looks really cool. He's an attractive young man and everything else. Don't take that the wrong way, Aiden. But he's just he is a really cool dude, and he's really good. This is kind of a group of introverts and stuff like that, and he's kind of drawing people out of their shells, which is cool. And I haven't really spoken to him all that much, just a little bit in passing, but we started talking about D&D and stuff, and we started getting into a more intensive conversation, particularly because he had a friend of his that he brought with who actually has attended the philosophy group, the another group that I'm a member of, and she's been there once, and that's where I knew her from. So there's an intermingling that's happening with my social scene, which is kind of interesting too. But anyway, he's talking about his hobbies, right? We're talking about video games and stuff like that. And he starts going on his helmet, his motorcycle helmet. He's pointing to a sticker, and he says, "This is my Skylander," and he's like, "I like to collect Skylanders." And he starts going on, and I've heard this word before, but I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what it meant, and so finally I asked, and the whole table heard me. I said, "What is a Skylander?" And the whole table went silent when I asked that question, because apparently it was like asking, you know, what is air? what is food? And it took everyone a moment to realize this guy is serious. He doesn't actually know. And I've had that happen before. A different crowd, they were talking about White Claws and about like white girls getting drunk on White Claws. I'm like, what is a White Claw? And they're like, well, it's kind of a spritzy, fruity, kind of hard cider type thing. I'm like, oh, Zima, a Mike's Hard Lemonade. They're like, Mike's Hard Lemonade, that's the one. I'm like, okay, so I can translate, but I have to, a lot of times, especially with some of these terms that these kids use, they're explaining things to me, and I'm like, you're gonna have to break it out into a paragraph for me. And there's like a translation, especially when you're talking about these really elaborate relationships that these kids have. Sometimes they put a lot of labels on stuff, and so I like break it down. I'm like, oh, you mean friends who flirt or something like that? That's what this old man brain is parsing that as, whatever. But anyway, so he's like, well, he takes the question legitimately. He's very respectful. He's not like, oh, you dummy or anything like that. He's like, well, back in the 2010s, there was this thing called, I think, like Toys to Life, or I don't remember his term, where you it would have a toy, and then you could put it on the game and it would shoot it onto the screen. I'm like, oh, I remember those. The Wii U had that, where these the Mia Boos or whatever they were, Amiibos or something, and you'd put it on there, and your little dude would show up, and he's like, yeah, that's it. I'm like, okay, so I understood the technology, I understood the concept. I just This was a line of those toys that had been a thing, which is like 10, 15 years ago now. So this is like core to their childhood, right? So I suppose it would be like someone my age saying, what is a transformer? Like, you know, is that the electrical thing that hangs off of a telephone pole, or whatever? And you're like, oh, you don't really know what a transformer is. Well, let me tell you about Optimus Prime, or whatever. But that those kind of moments really bump me, and I think it bumps the rest of the group, like, oh shit, this guy's an old geezer, and it's wild though, because I mix in with them. I don't I feel like they're my peers, and they treat me like their peers, and we talk back and forth and stuff. I think there's some times, especially with the younger folks, where they're kind of listening to my advice. They're gentle with it. They're just asking what I think about stuff or whatever. And sometimes they're looking for that dad energy, which I have plenty of that to give. I will give out as much of that as you want. Good job. Congratulations on passing your test or whatever, and they love it. Man, these kids. But but that's not my role, right? And so I've been trying to figure out, where's my place here, in this group? Because, like, if I'm going to use some sort of, fictional analogy, like, say, well, let's talk about the Lord of the Rings. Okay, I'm not Gandalf. I'm not the wizened old dude. I mean, you know, I know I don't look like I'm 20, but I also know that I'm holding up pretty well for my age. And a lot of us are. My ex, she's looks fantastic for 53 years old. And, my um, a friend of mine in the philosophy group, she looks great for her age. And there's another one that's I'm thinking about, looks great for her age, and on and on. I can think of these people who, when I was in my 20s, when I thought about somebody who's my age, 48 years old, like, they were like heading on to the greater pastures. They looked really rough. And when you were 65, that was like death's door. Like, these folks look leathery. My instructor, I remember this was 10 years ago, he was 65. One of the head of the school in karate, he was 65, and he could whoop my ass at sparring. He was amazing. He was fast and big too. And if that's what he's at 65, I can't imagine what this guy was like in his prime. And you see some of these older guys, that are in the 70s and stuff, that are doing the karate demos in the Olympics and stuff. And, they're moving kind of slower, but damn, they're still really good. But when I think of 65 year olds when I was, a kid, a lot of them were on oxygen and stuff. Smoking was a huge factor, and I don't think a lot of the younger kids don't get it. They don't know what life was like. You had cigarette vending machines. There was no carding for cigarettes. You just throw a quarter or whatever is what it would cost. You just pull this thing out. You go to a restaurant, it's just a constant haze of smoke. Not smoking or non-smoking doesn't really matter, because you're going to be inhaling secondhand smoke anyway. You can smoke on airplanes. You could put an open flame in a flying tin can at 20,000 feet, filled with bottled oxygen and jet fuel. And the only time you couldn't smoke was when the pilot switched the no smoking sign on, so that your cigarette didn't go flying through the cabin somewhere. You had ashtrays in the handle, in your armrest. Ashtrays in your armrest. That's what the world was like not that long ago, within my living memory. And I'm not crazy old. But it was just a different world. And so, using that as a point of reference, and I think, man, if I was in my 20s and there was this dude who's almost 50 years old hanging in my crowd, I don't know how I'd feel about that. You know what I mean? But, I'm not creeping on anybody or anything weird like that. So it's, they welcome me, and I feel welcome, and I feel like I belong and jive with them. But every now and again, I feel like this is kind of weird when you admit it, fellas. I'm coming to terms. I am coming to terms now with the fact that I'm pretty sure right now my best friend, right now, just turned 30. I attended his birthday party, a couple months ago out in the hills. He invited me to this place out in the hills, this cabin that he rented. And at one point, we are all having a great time. And I told him, "Yeah, honestly, I don't even know why you like me, man, because we're so different in a variety of other ways. But I appreciate it. I really do. I like you, but I don't get it, you know." And he looks at me, he's like, "You're what are you talking about, man? You've always been decent to me, and you know I like hanging out with you and role playing all that stuff. Get over yourself, you know." So he's right. He's right in that regard. But it's not just it's all these different groups is how it is. In my role playing group, there are two people I can think of, three that I can think of that are older than me. Two of which are dungeon masters themselves. One of them is very OG, and he looks like an old man. You know, because he is. He's pretty old. He's from the old school, like first edition days when he was in college or whatever, which is that's pretty far back. Another guy though, he looks pretty good actually for his age. He's in his 50s, but he's in pretty decent shape in terms of his, you know, skin and complexion and everything else. But another guy who's exactly my age isn't holding up so well. And so I'm looking at him and like, do I look like that? You know? But he clearly doesn't take care of himself very well, you know, so that's a big factor. I have not worked out lately because I've got insomnia is murdering me right now, and just I can't, it was weeks ago since I had a full 8 hours of sleep. That's something I've been struggling with like crazy. Stop drinking caffeine. Yeah, I need the caffeine so I can work, and left to my own devices, I will stay up till 6 a.m. and then wake up around noon or 1. That's how I roll, you know. That's where my clock wants to be. It's really weird. It's kind of sucky, you know. It's like I don't want to work graveyards. I just want to be up during graveyards, you know what I mean? But anyway, uh all this to say, I don't really even have a conclusion about that. Normally I have some place I'm going. It's just something I just keep thinking about and keep encountering, and I don't know what it means. And the other thing too is, this is not to say like there's any significant interest, okay, but I have noticed a couple of times where there's mild flirting and sort of kind of moments where I'm talking with these, they're kids, they are younger than me, where that I think they might be expressing interest, and not anything crazy. Again, I want to be very clear, but I'm like, did that just happen? No. And then, of course, I'm thinking, because why? What? You know what I mean? But another friend of mine, she tells me that she has 20 somethings approaching her all the time. And she'll be like, "You know how old I am, don't you?" Because she's very open about her age. And she'll be like, "I know, you know who you're dealing with, right?" And they're like, "Yeah, I don't care." And they're talking about serious relationships. And it's like, do you understand that what you're talking about, if you're actually serious, is stubbing out your family line with me? Because I can no longer have children you recognize. You know what I mean? Like, not that I'm putting words in her mouth, but that's kind of what you're dealing with. Now, she looks fantastic for her age. I will give her that. But it's got to be flattering for sure. But you know, and of course I'm teasing her. I'm like, you don't want to skin that apple, you know. You don't want to pluck that fruit from the tree and corrupt it, you know. And but she's like, no, oh God, I couldn't handle the aftermath of that, you know. But anyway, it's a strange time. But what's very strange too, though, is I've been reflecting upon this, because I belong to a very, that they call us Xennials, and that is a very slim subgeneration or microgeneration that sociologists are actually starting to take seriously now, because they're realizing that it's not just us acting like we think we're special because we're Gen X. We don't think we're special, you know. We don't think anyone is special. No one is special if we all are, you know, whatever. But we have this very unique transitional experience, okay, in our lives, in the very formative years of our lives. And it I know this, I couldn't put my finger on it, but I remember when I was in high school, say when I was a freshman, that the seniors were, they felt like they were from another world. Not crazy, but when I think of people born, say, before 1975 or so, I think of a world where they grew up, where they were roller skating and in arcades and fairs and, you know, lots of, you know, that kind of outside fun and bikes and all that other stuff, bikes with ramps and skateboarding and stuff like that, which is generally associated with the Gen X experience that they get all nostalgic about. And then once you hit what I'm bracketing it between 1976, because that's an arbitrary number, but it was the bicentennial. If you're born before, but between 1976 and 1982, which put you in the class of 2000, maybe 1983, put you in the class of 2000. Okay, because the class of 2000 actually has an interesting delineation because the Department of Education and a bunch of other folks were trying to pump stats up so that when the millennium hit, look how awesome our numbers were. And what that meant was the younger kids, about 5 or 6 years younger than the, or older rather than the class of 2000, had to suffer all these things where they were replacing books and they were rebuilding campuses and stuff like that. My middle school, when I started in 1992, I guess it was, no, 1990, was brand spanking new. Like you could smell the paint on the walls. And the same with when I went to the high school, which was over the hill. That was the same deal. We could see it under construction, and the folks that were a year or two behind us, or ahead of us rather, they would have to be, their entire school year was in portables, or some of them were like bussed off to other places and stuff because of this transitional thing that they were trying to do for that class to pump up the national averages or whatever. It was a big program, okay, whatever. But I think that sets a very good bracket to explain what's happening. And what I here's the explanation I'm going to give you. A 13-year bracket, okay? A 13-year bracket starting from 1987 to the year 2000. Okay. In 1987, we had a Nintendo Entertainment System. We had 4 head VCRs. We had tone phone systems were new. Beforehand, they were Pulse. We had cellular phones, but they were big, heavy, cancer-causing beasts that were extremely expensive. Pagers were like the provenance of drug dealers and doctors. Um, and there was no internet. Computers, I think, was it x86, and then you had like the Coleco and the the Texas Instruments thing, the TI-80 and stuff. That was Pong, or not Pong. That was a little bit earlier, but like you didn't. There was not really a lot of computing equipment, and certainly none of it was networked, not in a consumer grade, right? Schools would sometimes have networking of some crude amount, but most of it was mainframe. Typewriters were how you wrote. So there were word processors for also, again, an expensive device, which is where we get a lot of the ANSI standards, like carriage, return, line feed is part of the mechanism of those old IBM typewriters, that we still deal with that as a programming concept today. Um, so fast forward to the year 2000, we have plasma screen TVs. We have the internet is ubiquitous. Most people have modems. There's broadband now. Uh, there PCs are in everyone's home, and most people have one. DVD players, CD players have been around for a long time. Uh, you know, newspapers, people are starting to not use those anymore. When in 1987, the newspaper was the only way you got information, unless you went to the library. Uh, you know, you could get your news online. And things were just way different in that 13-year period. Why I'm using the 13 years? I have a computer right now, a PC, and the motherboard inside of it, I bought it in 2013. Okay, so it's 2012 when it came from, but let's just say a 13-year period. This computer, I have upgraded all the RAM to its best capacity and the processor to its best capacity, which cost me nothing. But at the time, basically, that rig would have cost me about $3,000. So it's like top of the line, the best you could have bought when it first came out. The motherboard itself, it's a Bitcoin miner type of, I wouldn't say it's hardened, but it's a pretty tough motherboard. It was not that was the whole thing. The only thing that's interesting about it is that I replaced the video card in it with something that was probably, I would say, made 6 years or so after that motherboard was made. So it's compatible though. It's compatible with this awesome video card. I can run that machine right now. I can play modern games. I was able to, probably the heaviest game I was able to play on it was Zenless Zone Zero, the beta of it, which it was below minimum spec just a bit, but it still ran it respectably, enough for me to to test that, which was a fun thing to do. But all the games that I generally play that are not they're not super intensive, and the current versions of that stuff will run on here. All internet stuff. It won't run Windows 11, but I don't think that's a huge detraction, to be honest. Oh no, I can't have AI open with every time I like Clippy, every time I open any application. I'm going to cry, you know. So it has to use an outdated operating system, but that operating system works fine and stuff runs on it just fine. It's just Microsoft trying to sell you stuff because they don't want you to have a 13-year-old computer, you know? Um, but where I'm getting at with that is the functionality of that device still works quite functionally in a modern context. Now it's not the best. I can't run the crazy frames and all that stuff, right? And of course, graphics and everything else. Lots of improvements have happened since that machine came out, but the amount of actual social disruption based on technological development has not happened in anywhere near what had happened between the period of 1987 and 2000, which is basically when I grew up. I was 9 years old when I got that Nintendo Entertainment System in 1986 or 87, and I had to hook it up because my folks couldn't figure it out because they had an analog understanding of electronics. And I'm going to give you an example of what I'm talking about. In the movie Back to the Future, Marty McFly has a very fancy device. This takes place in 1985, and I think he's supposed to be 16 or 17 or something like that. So he's about 8 or 10 years older than me. So he's earlier Gen X, but he's still Gen X. But he has this JVC camcorder. It was kind of a product plug, I think, part of the movie, right? And it's in 1955. Doc, what's his name? Doc. I can't remember his name. Anyway, the doc, he says, this is a TV studio in your hand. You have a camera and a microphone, everything in here. And it has a digital display. Everything in this is actually a computer, not a heavily functioning computer, but it was a high-end consumer device that would record to VHS, and you could record it and all that, record and playback and everything else. There's a little VCR in there too. The thing is that in order to watch that tape, you have to hook it into a television, and most televisions were cathode ray tubes with a technology that had been around for about 30 years, okay, 1955. So he goes back in time after recording this thing, and he calls Doc Brown, that's his name. He goes to Doc Brown's house, the old, you know, the doc that's his friend in the current time. He goes to visit him in the past because he's the only person he knows. His parents are kids now. And to prove his point, what he does is he hooks this thing into Doc's 1955 black and white television. Okay. When I saw that, I remember when I was a kid, I watched that movie and I thought, how did he hook that up? And that was not a rhetorical question. This is a realistic thing that he was doing, because the way those TVs worked is that they had antennas. And a lot of the times what they would do is they would recognize that the built-in antenna may not be sufficient for whatever reason. You lived in a valley or whatever, because this is broadcast over the air, these airwaves. So sometimes what people would do, this did not happen, I don't think, in 1955, but it did come along a bit later, where you would have what's called a community antenna, CATV, which is on the back of your TV today still, this interface. That's what it stands for, folks. It's not cable TV like a lot of people think. It's community access television. What it was is you'd have an antenna up on the hill, and they power that bad boy and then lead cables down to the houses down in the valley. And that way they could get reception to their televisions delivered through this long copper cable. And you would have to override the bunny ears on the back of the television. And there was so what they would do is they would lead cables out from that antenna into these two screws that you could unscrew and pull the prongs out of that and detach the antenna, and then you could attach something else in there. So you could also have a really powerful antenna. And again, you would take these two prongs and screw it down, and then you would have this other device, a bigger, more powered antenna or whatever, that you would use to get reception. So using that interface, this computer device, which is using all new stuff in here, still had to talk back to these old devices. and would have a essentially it would broadcast on a channel into its little output, and then you would lead that into the antenna. So it was not an antenna, but it was feeding a hard signal for channel 3 or channel 4 or channel 2, whatever the device had the ability to do. And you would switch your TV to that particular channel, and the broadcast, so to speak, from that device would come into the television. Okay, so even if you couldn't, though, this is what I was thinking even back then. If you couldn't detach the antenna, how would you make that work? So what I would probably do is take copper wire and coil it around those little prongs that would come out of these things to create essentially just a long, like a hard set of wire that you could coil around the bunny ears of the antenna and probably accomplish the same thing. So he may have had to jury rig it in order to make it work, but he could very easily have made it work because he understood how to interface with that old technology. And that is inherent in all of us that worked with that stuff when we were kids. And that is the first type of electronics that I worked on. The first type of electronics I really ever messed with was the Nintendo Entertainment System, which had a similar functionality. And then later, not too long later, we got a four-head VCR, and the four-head VCR had all sorts of digital stuff. So both the Nintendo and this VCR had what are called context menus. I compare this to the Atari. The Atari had four switches on it. Click, 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 click. And it was on and off. There was a reset, and then there was like modes, and then I think you could like toggle some things. But any configuration of the game was done with these switches. You'd get yourself set up how you wanted to play, and then you would take your one button joystick. Imagine playing a video game with one button, guys. And you would play Asteroids or Centipede or Pac-Man. Didn't even require the button. You would just run around the maze or whatever. But these games were very simple. They were points, and you would just go as far as you could until you lost your lives or whatever. So video games were a novelty, and Atari even had a wood paneling, and it kind of died an ignominious death. I'm going to make a video about that someday because that's just a story that's too good not to tell. But the Atari kind of fell away, and the Nintendo sooner or later kind of came along and replaced it as the ubiquitous system that people had. There was another system that came out a little earlier, the Sega Master System, but it didn't have the same. It didn't have the same teeth. The Genesis came along though, and it did that. That was a 16-bit system, and that started to eat Nintendo's lunch a little bit. And that's when the console wars began. That Uncle from Another World is talking about. But this four-head VCR, when we got it, there's a joke that a lot of people also don't really get nowadays, the blinking 12 light. So when you would plug a device like that in there, the first thing that would happen is it would blink 12, or if the power went out or whatever, it would blink 12 because the clock lost its memory. It didn't know what time it was. And so it's flashing 12 to let you know, hey, you need to set the time. You don't have to set the time on these things. It's not a necessary thing to make it function. So you have buttons on the front of this thing. You would put the tape in, you'd shut the thing down, or maybe you might load it in the front. If it had a loader, that was a new thing. That's what our VCR had. It was this, but that's what made it fancy. And it was also black too. It wasn't the silver thing. It didn't have the wood paneling like the original VCRs did. And it was a four-head VCR, which meant the fidelity of the screen was better. But this is why he bought it. My mom's ex, my stepfather, he would get high and order stuff off of QVC, because the blonde lady is showing you how amazing this thing is, and he just using the tone telephone system, he would call up and use this cable thing. But anyway, he gets this VCR. And he was using it that way. He could figure it out that much. He could get it to plug in, but then his cable wouldn't work. And in those days, in order to get HBO or whatever, if you had premium channels, the way that happened is you would pay for the box. You would rent the box, and they would put a special chip in there, which was hackable. And you could go to jail. I saw a commercial once where the guy's like standing in front of the camera, or he's like, "Do not hack cable boxes, or you will go to jail." Like that was part of his public service arrangement. But anyway, but the thing is all he understood was I have to unplug everything to plug the VCR in order to watch a movie on the VCR, and then I have to unplug that and plug in the cable box in order to watch the cable box. Now, I had explained to him, no, look, I've got the Nintendo on an interrupt feed here. You put the Nintendo in the front of this thing so that when you turn the Nintendo on, it will override all signals that are coming in here and play on channel 3, just like the cable box is. So When I turn the Nintendo off, everything comes off. He didn't like the idea that the Nintendo took priority either. I had to explain to him why this was a good idea. But then you turn the Nintendo off and the feed from the cable would come in. So the Nintendo took priority. If I want to play the Nintendo, it just I play it and it takes over the TV. I turn it off, it turns it off, and the cable box is functional again, right? But the problem with the VCR is it belongs somewhere in the middle because it had some features. So it was a cable box in and of itself. And if you didn't pay for premium channels, you wouldn't actually need to rent the box. That's what I was trying to tell him. But we had HBO and Showtime or whatever. So you had to have that. And the trade off was this: the cable box that was inside the VCR could handle multiple channels in that you could record off of one channel and watch another. You could also program it to kick off a recording at any time you wanted. There's a lot of features of things. I had all sorts of features, and I was explaining it to him. I was like 10 or 11 when I got this thing. Like it can play Spanish if you're interested in that. We don't speak Spanish. Well, yeah, I know, but it's cool. It'll do subtitles too. We're not deaf. Come on, you're killing me, dog. But when someone like him would get one of these devices who were older than us, like older than anyone born in 1976, invariably, if they didn't let their kids mess with this device, that 12 o'clock would be blinking because no one was programming it. No one was setting the time, right? Because they understood plugging the thing in. They understood the play button, the record button, the fast forward, and the rewind. They understood these analog style functions. But the context menus that the thing was capable of doing, where you could go clock, I want to set time, I want it to be, military time, set the time zone or whatever, like all those things that, like in say, when Microsoft Office, you have file, and then that opens up a window and it'll be like print, and you select the print, and it's like, do you want to print to PDF or print to the printer or whatever, change the margins or whatever. It's, you go deep into menus and you come back up and do other things as you go through those menus. Those are called context menus. And you would have context menus on devices, including your sometimes even your phone, but your answering machine, which would also have the phone built in sometimes, and other kinds of electronics that were starting to show up, consumer electronics, where it would have a small display that is all LCD or whatever, but you would have to conceptualize what the menus looked like, because you'd say, okay, I want to scroll through the menus, blah 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 blah. Okay, time. Hold on and press that enter, and then okay, I'm in the time menu. All right, what do I want to do in here? And scroll down that, right? Those context menus still existed, but you had to conceptualize where you were in the menu to figure out what you want to do. Or more accurately, you're kind of searching through a hierarchy. It's like, I want to set the time, so that's a clock function. You would scroll through this clock, there we go, that looks right. Set time, there it is. This concept was very, very new and only showed up about 1985 or so in consumer electronics. My experience with electronics started there and had to interface with all this old stuff that was still analog. Okay. And that really defines our weird little subgeneration. When they talk about the transition that we went through, again, that like 13-year bracket or so, while our brains were still elastic and plastic or whatever they call plasticity, we were forming our understanding of electronics from a way of interfacing. We were translating, you might even say, this new world that was being developed right before our eyes at a rapid pace. Boy, every 6 months, it was like all your stuff is junk. So we are able to process the old stuff and interface with it, which is the nostalgia part of being part of Generation X. But we more naturally integrate with millennials because our view of the world is very similar, because we grew up that way. The internet, I was very lucky. I had early access to the internet. I think the first time I accessed the internet itself was 1993. And I believe I was accessing bulletin boards and stuff when I was in middle school. So there was a game called Legend of the Red Dragon. And you would have these, computer that you would call in, and they'd have a bank of 6 modems, and up to 6 people could be connected. It was a minor network that you could connect and play these muds and kill each other. And muds are what they're called. I don't remember what it stands for, but they were text games that you would. I go into the hotel where this guy's sleeping, and I kick him out of bed and duel him or whatever. But anyway, that is part of why I know that I get along with millennials who are 10 or 15 years younger than me better than I do almost every other member of Generation X. Okay. And the other part is that we're a lonely subgeneration. The lowest birth year on record until recently was 1974. Okay. When I was growing up, within bike riding range for me, that was my world. There were not one but two elementary schools out of the three in that sphere that were mothballed. They were facilities built for the baby boomer generation. But by 1974, because of the pill and because of Roe versus Wade, our generation, just Generation X in general, and particularly my tail end, because 1973 was Roe versus Wade, I will point out, and the lowest birth year was 1974. Contentious issue, but demographic fact. Generation X tailed off pretty heavily, and the millennial generation had to pick up. You don't see that in demographics. You don't see it. Generations below you have more kids unless there's some plague or whatever that wipes out a generation. There are fewer of Generation X by far than there are both boomers and millennials. Okay. And my bracket 19, if it follows that if you take into account someone who was born in the United States during this time, the fewest of the age of people who are born in the United States in this country right now, if you count for attrition, is going to be 52 years old. And 48 is not far because we were like this, right? So there are very few of us in the first place. We have once we got out into the world, we obviously had our schoolmates, but once we got out into the world, there were very few people exactly our age. There are many people who are older and many people who are younger, 5 or 6 years, in either direction, but not our age. We really don't encounter each other very frequently because there's so few of us. It's kind of wild to think about that. How many people do you know, Mr. 48-year-old, that are 48, 49, 50, 51, 52? I know a handful. I know plenty of 45-year-olds. I know plenty of 55-year-olds. I don't know many that are between those ages. It's really crazy to think about. But anyway, um, that's anecdotal, I suppose. I can go find them, I suppose. But statistically speaking, we are very few. So we're going to have to make friends where we can find them. Um, and of course, I was into Japanese animation when it was not cool. I was into role playing when it was not cool. I was in all these things when it was not cool, comics, all that stuff. Now that it's kind of mainstream, so I have some credentials because even though I'm not up on the newest stuff, for example, they talk about Pokemon a lot at this anime group that I'm a part of. I know what Pokemon is because I came out when I was 19, 20, something like that, and it was on the Game Boy Color. I remember. I know what they are. You got to catch them all. There are two games. They follow that paradigm where you have two games, and not all the monsters are in each game, and so you have to pair up to trade guys with each one so you can fill out your Pokédex and collect them all. I remember that. It's different now. It's a different set of games and stuff. And I watch people play this 3D game where they're like hunting them and actually throwing the ball. And the game I played was, on a screen like this, like I'm not joking either. It was so small. It was so small. And you get these magnifying glasses and lights and stuff to just try to like make it something you could see. The Game Boy, it was very advanced, but it was tough, boy. That was a tough device to play with, but we were so dedicated, man. It was hard, man. Back in my day, we had to play games on LCD screens. There was no backlight on those screens. Be thankful for your backlight. But I understand what they're talking about. Whereas my ex would have no idea. She would have no idea about any of this stuff. And because she's 5 years older. And that's not a slight on her. That's just the way it is. And she doesn't understand a lot about how I think about technology. She doesn't think that way. She still thinks in the analog way. And the way she organizes is still in that analog way. They didn't pick this up in the same plastic way that we did. Not to say that there weren't older Gen X that weren't into this stuff that still learned it and got and acquired that knowledge. But this is the childhood, like before I was like when I was learning to read, right? That's what we're talking about. And I like to think I'm a little smart, so I was able to pick this up a little faster than some people. But I was able to outshine my stepfather, who was in his 30s or whatever, in hooking this stuff up and making it work. We did not have a blinking 12 in my home because I programmed that VCR, and I was constantly instructing him on how to use it because he could not figure it out. It did not stick with him. And I compare that to the fact that I can remember 10-digit phone numbers. I don't do that much very often because I've offloaded that to this handy device. But I still remember my 10-digit phone number from when I was a child. But those earlier generations, when they didn't use area codes ever because long distance was super expensive and you usually didn't have a reason to call long distance anyway, why do you want to talk to your people that you moved away from 20 years ago or whatever? But prefixes. So you have today, you have a 11 or up to 13 digit phone number, right? Your country code, which in America it's one, and you don't usually have to do that when you're calling in the United States or Canada. Your 3-digit area code, which those have gotten smaller and smaller as more phone numbers get issued into different area codes. You have the prefix, which is another 3-digit, which is a prefix, I suppose you might even call that, where your substation is. Although that's not really all that relevant anymore in cell phones, but that's the way it was. It was a physical location as well, like an area code. And then you'd have your actual phone number within that prefix, that subzone within the area code within your country. But because when they started adding prefixes, because phones became so ubiquitous, the people who were using phones back in the 40s and 50s, they couldn't retain 6 numbers. They weren't able to retain that. And so they came up with shorthand where they would use how the phone has letters on there that correspond to numbers. They would come up with a colloquial, common name for their phone number for the prefix, which was only 2 numbers before it was 3. And I know what my phone number when I was at the house was growing up because that's what it was when my mom was a kid. It was Cherry 2620, which is, I don't know, 2 and 5 or so, 2526. It would be 26, 242, no, 242, 24. It was 24, 24, 2442. I don't know. Anyway, but it was Cherry 2620. That's how they would remember this stuff because they couldn't retain more than those 4 numbers. It was too hard for them. They didn't have the plasticity. They didn't need to retain numbers like that in the Depression and stuff. Their wallets certainly didn't have more than that, right? But this is part of when you're growing up and you have to retain at least a 7-digit number and also know your area code. So that's a 10-digit number right there that you have to know growing up. And you would dial up, because you had to know if you were dialing long distance because those things were getting smaller. We were not long distance to call 425 885 6560 or something like that. I can't quite remember it. I can't. 885 7529 885 7529. I do remember it. The Nintendo hotline. Boy, those poor bastards. Because it was free. And it was long distance, though. And so they'd be on the phone. I'd be just chewing on their ear about whatever game I played. And they'd finally be like, oh, it's long distance. Your mom and dad don't want to pay that. And I'm like, guess what, sucker? I'm in 206. I don't pay a dime. And he'd be like, oh, no. I'm stuck with this kid. But, God, 85 7529. How about that? 425. But anyway, but that's part of it. It's the way your brain gelled and the way our brains gelled in this very slim segment of Generation X that heads into millennial that is so much more akin to millennial that makes me able to identify with them so much better. Now I have a lot to learn from them. We had other stuff that the Gen X experience, tamp those feelings down. You're abandoned, all that other stuff that we all talk about. That stuff it was real. It was real. Most of us were turned loose. Don't come back till dinner. That was a word. That was a phrase that we all heard. We all did. Don't come back home till dinner. I don't want to see your ass. Don't show your face round here no more until I have to feed you because it's my responsibility. That is the world we all grew up in for the most part. It's very rare to have a parent that didn't say stuff like that because they were tired of our asses hanging around the house, tearing it up because there was nothing to hypnotize us with. They couldn't put us in front of the TV. The TV wasn't, it'd be like Pat Roberts would come on. Pat Robertson. So we had Saturday morning cartoons. That was when cartoons were on, was Saturday morning. And sometimes early in the morning. That was a new thing. That was cartoons in the morning or whatever. But there were color patterns. I remember when I was little, I'd get up and drive those parents nuts because I'd turn the TV on and there were colors on the screen. It would go, like because the TV did not have television. There was three channels when I was little, and they would go offline at like 11 o'clock. It was a whole thing where they'd like raise a flag and play the national anthem, and then it was static after that. There was nothing. It the fact that you did not have television broadcasting on a constant basis, and when only those three channels would only have select times for cartoons, and then we had church on television. Pat Robertson, I was just thinking about this. I'm sorry I spaced out about that because we called it church TV. It was like, oh man, it's church. And when that would happen, cartoons were over. You got to go find something else because I'm not watching Pat Robertson's ass. I don't know if you guys remember Pat Robertson. Certainly not. He was like, you know, this guy is called the 700 Club. And I don't know what that stood for either. It was probably some biblical reference. And he'd be talking about church on public, not public, but on like the CBS channel. That was on TV when we were growing up, when we were little. And that guy's face would come on like, oh God, there goes the fun. All right, time to pick up a stick and run out in the yard. That's how it was. That's how it was. So we remember that old world. But this new world we were able to adapt to pretty quickly because it happened during our formative years. So I think that's why I get along with them so much. But I don't know why they get along with me so much. That's the thing. I don't know why they want me in this group. It's really crazy. It's wild. So it's oh God, I don't know where I belong. I don't know where I belong with them. I'm enjoying my time with them, and there's no pressure or anything like that. But it's times like last night where I'm snapped into reality. I'm like, Jesus Christ, I'm an old man hanging out with these young kids, man. And nobody seems to notice. Nobody seems to care until times like that. We're like, holy shit, this guy doesn't even know the most basic aspects of our popular culture. But with Dungeons and Dragons, at least, I am in a position of authority when I play as a dungeon master, sort of. I'm not bossing anybody around, but I'm kind of somebody they're turning to give them answers and give them an adventure and stuff like that. And sometimes like I'm a dad or a mentor or something like that. I'm very sensitive to listening to what they have to say and to offer my advice about certain things because obviously I have more life experience. But one thing I will say, though, the millennials have it way harder than we did, period. There's no question. One of the other jokes that came up at the TV yesterday, or at the anime club yesterday, was my friend is 24. He has a house. His dad died, but he's a property owner. How about that? And that is a novel statement because the boomers had houses at 24. My mother had a house at 22 years old, 23 years old, and that was not uncommon. The idea that a 24-year-old can have a house being a ludicrous statement is what they're dealing with now. I got my first house at 27, and I had a child at 24. And these kids are still they're living with their parents. And I say kids, I'm talking about 30-year-old people. These are adults whose lives have been stunted by our economy now. The stripping of the wires that is happening by the boomer generation above us, and we, Generation X, can't or won't stop them. The older Generation X is turning into boomers. They're doing the same shit. It's really frustrating to watch because they've abandoned the light. And us Xennials who still remember, but we also understand the new world, we identify with them. And it kills us to watch that. Every one of us that I've talked to that are my age, we see this and talk in helpless terms. We got the last scraps as they were slamming the door and kicking the ladder out from everyone underneath. I got an entry-level computer job and it helped me advance my career. Those things don't exist anymore. They all got shipped off to India. They want people to have 10 or 15 years of experience here now. No one trains anyone, you know? And then when they do stuff like, oh no, we're going to have to pay for H1Bs now, the schools and hospitals are going to suffer. Schools are meant to teach people. Why are you hiring people from overseas on special visas when you're supposed to educate people? Same with the medical facilities. Educate people, bring people in and train them on this crazy equipment or whatever. They're not doing that. They're expecting everyone now that starts working to have experience. I was just talking with somebody else again at this group. She just graduated college a couple months ago. She knows what her vocation is. I was really shocked and pleasantly surprised at how specialized. She knows exactly what she wants to do. And then she's like, you need 3 years of experience. They won't let me in, no matter how passionate I tell them I am about this field. How does she get experience if you won't actually offer her the job, guys? Go to India? Is that the plan? It's killing me, dog, to watch this. And there's nothing we can do. Our leadership is asleep at the wheel of what's happening to this generation. They don't care, though. It's not even that they're asleep at the wheel. They're bitching at them, saying that they're not working hard enough and pulling themselves out in their bootstraps because they're so myopic. Because back in their day, they could work a summer job and get a new car. To go to college now, at a minimum wage, I think they figured it out. It's like you have to work 100 hours a week or something like that. It's some crazy amount of just to pay for the college. And now, talk about burger flippers, 7.25 an hour. You can't even buy a burger for that. You'll be flipping that burger for 1 hour and can't even afford to buy it. It if you don't laugh, you'll cry. These kids are in this hellish nightmare of an economy for them. I'm hanging on, but I'm watching my buying power slip back and back and back and back. I don't know when I'm going to be able to retire. That's another whole other issue, but that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with that. It does to some extent, but I'm afraid for my career because they look at me and they say, you're too damn expensive. We can offshore you. They look at the kids in this country and they're like, you don't have enough experience. We're going to offshore you too. Who's going to buy all this stuff? All these kids are living with their parents who managed to make it. Older Gen X and young boomers still. And maybe that's why I get along with them the most. And if there's any piece of fiction that comes to mind where I feel like I fit in somewhat to the paradigm, and some people will understand this and others won't, it's Final Fantasy VII. In Final Fantasy VII, there is a character named Sid Highwind. And he's the guy that has the airship. He's their engineer. And he's considerably older. He's like 10 years older than this 16-year-old crew. 26 in anime. It's like Logan's Run. The light is flashing on your hand. And it's time to shuffle you off. It's pass the torch, boy. It's kind of a trope there. But he was older than his friends, and he wasn't the leader. He had advice, and he had a kind of a gruff way of looking at things. His worldview was a little different, but he got along with them, and they all worked together. And I think that's kind of, if I was going to use an analogy, that's probably where I fit in. But I don't know. It's such a mystery because I don't know if this has ever happened in history, really, where you have this generation who is losing all that traction, and people who grew up in a similar fashion with this disruptive technology, like the printing press or something. I'm literate, just like you guys. Everyone older than me is not literate, is kind of how it feels. And so, of course, I'm going to get along with them. But it's like the illiterate people are stripping the literate people of their ability to stay employed. So their lives are passing away right in front of their eyes because they can't afford to do anything. I know a 30-year-old comes to mind. She wants to have kids, and the money is always the conversation. They're both working full time. She has a medical degree of some sort, a degree or a certificate. I don't know exactly. She could be helping people, but she watches rich people's kids because it pays better. I know a guy who got laid off from a bank, from a credit union, as manager of credit union. He went to go become a manager at a Cold Stone Creamery and gets paid more there than he did to manage people's finances, to help sling ice cream. Something is wrong here, folks. Where I'm going with that. But it feeds into this smaller issue, this little micro issue of mine. Where is my place here? This society is so busted compared to how it's supposed to be. I'm supposed to be the old man that they don't want in their group. And they're supposed to be having kids and stuff, and having their own homes and their own worries and stuff. And they don't. They don't. These kids aren't having sex. They're not getting in relationships and stuff because they're There's all sorts of other wounds from COVID and all these other things. But our birth rate is declining like rapid. It started 2022 or 2023, whatever it was. Lowest birth year on record since 1974. We're doing it again. But this time it's systemic. It's not because you can somehow negate or evade the consequences of your sexual behavior as it was in the boomers. Not that I'm passing any judgment, and I do believe in a woman's right to choose and all that other stuff. But there's a different, very different paradigm there than what's happening to this generation. They're being smothered. They are not a free love generation. They are trying to make it in any way they can. And I feel sympathy for them. And maybe that's it. Maybe that's it right there. I feel for them. I'm an older person that feels for them. And I'm one of the few, one of the very, very few that actually understands what they're going through. And it's terrible. Anyway, that's me.